Okay, great. So I'm Terry Marks-Tarlow, and I live in Topanga, and I've been in private practice in Santa Monica for more than 30 years, since the building was built. And I have, okay, I'm going to say that I'm a Jungian at heart, because I really think that's kind of my deepest, most connected place, spiritually connected, and the scientific side and the artistic side as well. I was going to say I'm a closet Jungian, but I think I can come out, so I'll say it's really where my heart
Come
is.
out of the closet, Terry.
All right. No, I think my background is I've sort of wandered through lots of different places. I got my Ph.D. at UCLA, and that was cognitive behavioral, and I did a dissertation in something I didn't believe in at all, and sort of proved it wrong, because I just didn't ever believe that thoughts are deeper than emotion, and so I went outside of my training to sort of supplement, and I encourage all of you to do that throughout what you do, although I'm sure you have a very well-rounded training here. And I did Gestalt. I've been doing yoga for almost 40 years, so that I've had that practice, sort of a body practice. I've taught as well. I've been accused of being a pretzel in a former life, because I'm really flexible, and I'm really old to be as flexible as I am, but I think it helps cognitively as well. My love is in nonlinear dynamics, and I'm going to pull that in here a little bit. But my first book was creativity curriculum. So art has always been an interest of mine. Creativity is a big interest. My second book applied nonlinear science to clinical practice, and I think that's my most creative side, is taking these sort of wild ideas in science, kind of at the forefront of science, and applying them. And that was a Jungian book. So it's called Psyche's Veil, and it's kind of hard to read because it's got a lot of math and science in it. But I take a couple of myths in that, like the myth of Oedipus and Psyche and Eros, and I translate them into both nonlinear and neurobiological. So I redo them from that point of view, which is certainly very Jungian. And then my artistic side comes out most recently in Mirrors at the Mind. And if any of you are artists, I hear that you draw, and if other people draw or do any sort of art photography, because everybody has an artist inside somewhere, this is will be in its 4th year, and this is how Juliet and I met. Juliet was one of the 4th one in November, and I really hope that you and your friends who are artists, whether they're students or practicing or whatever, please submit, and I'll let you know about that. So, and after doing that nonlinear stuff and realizing that most people are afraid of math and science, then I kind of grounded it more in neurobiology, and so I would say my community now is in interpersonal neurobiology, and I think it kind of pulls together all of this stuff. So as I talk, I'll hopefully bring little pieces of everything, and I'd love to make this very interactive. So let's start out with, so what is memory? What is memory, and why is it important to us as therapists? And if so, why? Yeah, there you go. There's the elephant in the room. So what is it? What's memory?
It's basically the only thing we have.
I agree.
It turns into moment. Well, we did read something about being 8 seconds in the past, but anyway, yeah. Go ahead.
It's the storage of experiences and information, and then it helps us to predict the future.
Mm-hmm.
And it's untraceable, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mechanism. It's how we know ourselves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
So connected to identity.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And as Rob said, it's recreated. I mean, we sort of,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
There's both physical and somatic and emotional.
Mhm.
It happens on all levels of our being, who we are.
Even archetypal, because would argue that there's things that we can recall that weren't necessarily our experience, but we can still tap into them.
Mhm. Okay, now I can go home because you've covered the whole.
Thank you so much for coming.
You're very welcome. I hope this was really informative. Any other thoughts about memory? So the way we think about memory, it's funny because we don't often actually talk about it, even though I agree with the first comment that in a way it's everything. It really is sort of everything. And when things are everything, they're also nothing, in a sense, because it can get so vague that it's hard to talk about it, but it really does cover the full range of everything. And the way that we think about memory is often, it's tied to the metaphors we use in understanding memory. So I'm a big fan of metaphors, and metaphors is certainly connected to the Jungian idea of myth, because myth is used as a metaphor when you look at the stories and then understand them metaphorically in terms of what's going on in your psyche. So I want to take a little bit of time with metaphors, and also want to ask you guys if you've ever studied Lakoff, who does metaphors, embodied metaphors, because I'm also really into embodiment, both through yoga, but I also dance and really believe that the body is where the action is. The body is where the unconscious is, and the body is where the action is in therapy. So before going into the metaphors of memory, I want to start with the idea of embodied metaphor. So nobody's familiar with us.
Have you worked with like Hakomi in that kind of area?
With whom?
Hakomi.
No.
It's embodied dance.
Is it? Yeah. Yeah, I just am on the edge of the expressive therapies. I just got an invitation in April for the group in Washington, D.C., or they're having a big conference. And I know that these people are so close to what I do and the theory and stuff, but I've actually never had any direct experience. So that's in April will be my first. And I have a feeling they're way ahead of me in terms of the theory, but
Can you tell them about
Lakoff, yeah.
the conference coming up that you're going
Oh,
to?
the UCLA conference, yeah. Let me say this to you now. In a couple of weeks, March 6th through 8th, UCLA is having the Interpersonal Neurobiology Conference, which is kind of like the huge Costco of conferences. Although this year it's on play and creativity and mindfulness, and I'll be talking about clinical intuition, which my last two books are on clinical intuition, and I hope you guys will check out the books. But also, please come to the conference. There are some amazing speakers, including Jaap Panksepp, who does animal stuff. If you're, with your dog and you feel like aligned with your dog. And my work actually also in the clinical intuition and psychotherapy book, I tell a lot of animal tales as clinical tales because of the evolutionary connection between intuition through the body, through the emotional circuits with our own intuitive roots. So please come if you're free. Alanis Morissette is speaking, and they have like a combination of celebrity and
She's really bright. I saw her speak and I was like, wow. I'm impressed.
She is bright, isn't she?
You wouldn't expect that.
Well, her lyrics are so good.
No, they
So,
have great ideas.
yeah.
Very, very good.
Right, but that people can't always articulate.
The name of the conference?
It's called the Interpersonal Neurobiology Conference. It's through UCLA Extension and the Lifespan Institute. And please do come.
It's March 7th, is that first weekend in March?
Yeah, March 6th through 8th, I believe. Dan Siegel, Alan Shore, a lot of different people. So,
Pass it down.
in terms of just embodied metaphors, the idea there is that that when we're babies, our first cognition happens through the body. And so when a baby picks up a cup and sticks it on his head as a hat, that's a physical, concrete metaphor, or a broomstick, and as a witch, so symbolic play and imaginary play, all is sort of incorporating objects into the body as a way of understanding concepts. And so the idea is that we kind of bootstrap that. We start with the body and then keep going, and eventually the concepts get disconnected from the body and disconnected from concrete objects. Does that make sense? So, these people really go far in understanding that kind of embodied metaphor, to the point where there's a book on mathematics as being part of the body, as being an extension of bodily processes. And so it's really great stuff. So when we're looking at metaphors, just keep in mind that it's a very holistic, body-oriented way of understanding thought and keeping thought connected, fully connected and grounded with the body. So there are first of all, the idea of memory, just even the word of memory, goes back to, I guess, Aristotle originally, and William James being somebody who really sort of ran with this idea. And it's a very top-down idea of memory. It isn't very grounded from the bottom. It's very top-down. And so that drives how we conceive of it, and how we've conceived of it over time. And the idea of mind as machine or mind as mechanism tends to be very implicitly part of our understanding of these kinds of concepts. So originally, and so what that does is it kind of drives how we think about memory, and it tends to originally, Plato's seal in a wax tablet was probably kind of the first way of understanding memory, and that's very static. It's very, you do a seal and it's there for all time in the tablet, and so that's been the template for a long time, and it's probably made it difficult to truly understand the more dynamic nature of memory, which actually is the way it is. So Aquinas, St. Augustine all follow in this idea of imprinting, memory as imprinting somehow, or impression. Freud, does anybody know how Freud thought about memory? It's kind of cool because he added something to it. So there was this thing called the mystic pad. If you ever, when you were a kid, done this things, it's like this wax tablet, where you take it like a tablet and you
Like an Etch-a-Sketch?
Sort of. It's like a 2-layer thing, and there's
a
wax thing,
Yeah, you peel it up
and you peel it off and it disappears. And the fact that it disappears on the top, but it doesn't disappear on the bottom, that the wax underneath it keeps a record of everything. So he used that as a way of distinguishing between short-term memory as the thing on the top and long-term memory as the tablet underneath. That's kind of a cool innovation. And of course, we know there's short-term and long-term memory. I'll talk a little more about that afterwards. And then when photography came into use, clearly that's people talk about having photographic memory. And there are some people that actually do have photographic memory, not most of us, but some people, where there's really this level of retention that's unbelievable. And there's a question of, well, how does that work? And does everybody have that capacity, or is that some weird, freakish thing that only a few people have? What do you guys think? Because that's actually a sort of a controversial issue. whether we all whether we all retain everything somewhere inside, but don't have access to it.
I
Or
think so.
you think so?
I think so. I think there's a lot of things that happen pre-consciously and unconsciously
Mm-hmm.
that we don't even realize we're picking up.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Certainly happens unconsciously.
Yeah, but I would think a lot is thrown away.
Whether it's thrown away in the sense of we don't have access to it, or it's thrown away in the sense that there's no storage to begin with, is an open question. I actually, I used to think it was thrown away because I have no memory at all. I mean, I'm like scary no memory for episodes. And I know the body definitely holds on to everything. And from a non-linear point of view, everything is embedded and you can get it. But I used to think that it was thrown away. Now I think that it's probably stored, and most of us don't have access to it. And I'll tell you why as we go along. But still the photograph is a fixed snapshot. And then, of course, with film, then we get a moving one. That's probably more like the space-time moving of an episode or something. And then there's the hologram for memory, and that's Carl Pribram sort of came up with that. And you guys wouldn't know what a hologram is, right? So there's a higher dimensional aspect. So with the theater, sort of the theater of consciousness being a higher dimensional kind of thing. Dan Siegel has a neurobiological definition of memory, and his is memory is the way the brain is affected by experience and subsequently alters its future responses, which is close to what you were saying before. So just off the bat, the linear static kinds of representations versus a non-linear view, I think is really important, that those while there's more there is a sort of a progression in those metaphors and the use of those images, they're still pretty static and they're pretty nonlinear. So I'm going to tell you about some research, some nonlinear stuff that is really cool, that has to do with memory and probably has to do, coming back to kind of the spiritual side of things, has to do with more like a Buddhist view of how reality works, or a mindfulness view. So there's a guy named Walter Freeman, who is kind of like the father of nonlinear physiology, and so he's kind of one of my heroes, one of my intellectual heroes. I don't like movie stars. I like people that are smart and have big brains and stuff. So he's one of my great guys. And so he studied the olfactory system of rabbits, so smell, and he was looking at single cells and patterns of cells in the olfactory bulb of the rabbit. And what he did was he would present a smell to the rabbit and then look at the pattern in the olfactory bulb, and then he would present another smell, look at the pattern, and go back to the first smell, and do it in various different ways. And first of all, what do you think if you present smell and there's a pattern, and then another smell, and you go back to the first smell? What do you think that pattern looks like? Does it, compared to the first pattern, do you think there's a resemblance? There isn't a resemblance? What does your intuition say? I know this is a weird question, but.
I didn't follow the train of thought.
Yeah.
Can you say that again?
more time?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so there's a smell. So let's say there's ammonia given to the rabbit, and then a rose, and then ammonia again. What do you think that when ammonia is presented again, what do you think the relationship between that and the first time it's presented?
Oh, I think it's altered. It's in the same way that when you go wine tasting and then you taste some wine, and then they give you, something to smell, and then you taste the wine again, and then you're gonna pick up those, possibly those or other variations in the smell. So whether it's similar, that may dull, or contrary, that may heighten. Right? So like a rose would take you in an opposite direction, so that when you go back to the ammonia, it'll heighten the sense of the smell. of the
Okay, very
ammonia.
good, very good. So it turns out that there's never any going back. And the underlying physiology of any sort of memory or anything in the brain, there's never any going back. So it isn't like an imprint that, then there's another imprint and then another, then the original imprint. It is totally altered all the time, which, sort of, it reinforces this idea that the present is brand new all the time. That even at the deepest level of brain physiology, there's always a novel piece to it, because we keep, and that's a great example, actually, the wine tasting one, because we keep unfolding experience in a way that changes what comes next, even if there's some resemblance to what came before. I love that example, actually, because that's a very, we can sort of feel that one in our body very easily. Does that make sense? That it's like that. So that's the non-linear piece of it. The one exception to that's kind of interesting is that this only works with the rabbits if the smells are meaningful. In other words, if there's some direct implication of the smell to the rabbit, like whatever, something about food or something about something else. And so meaning is very central to memory and to how we encode. And again, that tells us how holistic it is instead of just like sensory pieces. And your example is really great there too, because obviously when we wine taste, it's not just a taste, it's the whole experience. It's social, it's, there's everything to it. And
It's like a word cloud,
yeah,
where everything is connected to something else.
exactly. Everything is interconnected. And that's the basic, that is.
About that earlier.
Really? What were you talking about earlier?
Which example were you referring to?
Well, when you were saying that memory is holistic, and
Right.
it's part of the same.
Right. Yeah. So from a holistic point of view, everything is connected to everything else, and any little tiny thing alters everything else in profound and irreversible ways. And so, so these earlier kind of metaphors don't really work in that sense. They don't capture that. But obviously, our conscious minds are much more primitive than the rest of our bodies. At least that's my sense of what's more sophisticated, and it kind of reverses the idea that animals are somehow more primitive than we are.
It's interesting because what I'm curious about is you using a particular sense, and what I'm getting from what you're saying is that it's very present-centered. That the wax is pulled up every time we have a new experience, and it's wiped clean. Does that also carry over for other senses?
Yeah. It's definitely all present-centered. Yeah. And working memory is really interesting. I just found out some cool stuff about that today, and I'll talk about that because that has a lot to do. That is the most present-centered form of memory. That's the working memory is what we hold in our head for like 5 to 8 seconds, and it integrates the visual spatial with the words that we might prompt, with the body piece of it. So that is the most present-centered one, and it's very integrative and multimodal, and it seems to. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll get there in a little bit.
So it's present-centered, but it's not a tabula rasa present-centered. It's present-centered with primes, like you said, in another way.
It's present-centered with the entire history unfolded. which is a different kind of it's not present-centered in the sense of,
Learning something new, yeah.
yeah, things disappear.
Right.
That's what I was gonna say, because you said wiped away, and on the surface wiped away, but
Right,
still left an
underneath.
impression underneath.
Right,
So
underneath.
that's,
The entire history is embedded in a nonlinear system, and you can actually reconstruct, in a technical nonlinear system, you can reconstruct the entire history of the system from any point in the trajectory, which is very interesting and cool. So there's a difference between accessing memory, like all the memories or whatever, versus this idea of accessing the history of the system, which, yeah, I'm not even sure how that applies to formal memory, but it's just an interesting aspect of a nonlinear system, of which we are definitely. So there's a guy named Arnold Modell, who's a psychoanalyst, who does some cool work, and he is interested in the nonlinear stuff. And so his conclusion when he looks at Freeman's work with the rabbit and the smell and stuff is that meaning is achieved through action in the world, and in turn the self is altered by that action. So that brings in identity, and it brings in the whole body, because it's a body experience. It's an interaction with the world, and then meaning comes through that, and then memory encases that meaning. Does that make sense?
Is he the one who wrote about dreaming body? He works with coma patients.
Oh, that's Mandel, I believe. I know who you're talking, yeah.
well, he's a, oh, you said it's a psychoanalyst.
He's a psychoanalyst,
He
yeah.
brings everything into the moment, which falls into what you're saying about I guess what Rob was saying about present center, so that what's happening, what's being experienced on some sense is as a result of the real right now,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
also the projections from past, that they two combine to bring the moment into actuality at this time.
Yeah, there's a whole trend in the New York, like what's it called? Actually, it's not just New York, it's the East Coast. It's the Boston Process Group, where Dan Stern with the present moment and the now, and this whole idea of in therapy of these tiny little now moments being the moments of meeting. There's just a whole lot of people are into that, and the certainly the attachment people are into that, and the regulation people are into that. I'm into the combination of that, but then how that then relates to the bigger picture too. And I have a fractal way of understanding how the now moment has similar patterns with the larger, and I love fractals, but I think it's important not to lose the big picture too, and to change scales flexibly from those tiny little now moments, and then to zoom out, because if the meaning doesn't hold in tomorrow or next week or in some other way, then it's interesting, or you might have a moment of meeting with your therapist, but if the patient then forgets it the next day or whatever, it's less important than if they have this epiphany that then changes their life. So, I think all scales are interesting and important, and actually a fractal sort of model unifies the various scales so that the pattern is similar.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like this implies a trust in our embedded experience, that there isn't this sense of necessarily having to struggle to remember facts and details because there's a faith that will be with us.
Absolutely. I personally have been sort of shedding my words over time, and I think the more we do trust our bodies to remember, and just trust sort of the whole of us to call up what we need when we need it, in context, then the more we can sort of relax into what we do or don't remember, and try, and it's sort of, who cares if you can't remember something that's arbitrary, but we care a lot if you're in the moment and you need something, and do you have access to it? So yeah, that's a really,
Well, I keep thinking about Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now, and
Uh-huh.
at the beginning, he says, in his introduction, he goes, I have very little use for the past.
uh-huh,
And I remember thinking, like, how can you say that?
Uh-huh.
How can you live like that? But if you have this trust that the past is with you, whether you want it or not,
Right.
It's embedded.
yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
I think what he means is it's not that it's not important. Not that the past isn't important, but it's the focus on the now, the building of the now that is important.
No, I know, but it just struck me at a time, such a life remark, like, who are we without our past?
I think she's
Right.
dwelling on it.
Yeah.
The length of time, that the past is always within the present.
Exactly. If the past is already
It's already
embedded,
there.
then we don't have to focus on it apart from the present. And from an evolutionary point of view, the past, it appears that memory exists not to remember the past, like arbitrarily to remember the past, but to move into the future, which I think one of you said earlier is, yeah. So it's to guide us. It's to guide us in the present towards the future more than it's to just be able to recall something for the sake of recalling something.
It's like I think of the elephants in Africa, remembering where the watering holes are, things like that.
Mm,
It's
right.
It's a survival.
Well, and that's an interesting point. So you know how the Aboriginal people do it without writing it down. You know about dream lines, what those are, song lines. This is so cool. So song lines it is such a bleak territory in Australia that it is like a matter of life and death to remember this watering hole's here and this bush and this animal goes here. And so the culture had no written record, and so in order to remember in an ancestral sort of way, they would sing songs, and the songs would be a map, the map of the territory, and each area would have its own song that would tell you exactly what the geography of the area is. And music, actually, I was just reading a Scientific American brain article before coming here, that song actually unifies more of the brain than any other activity. So, that the memory, and also that people who have brain damage for language or whatever can reconnect it through song and through remembering old songs and this. And I'm sure you've seen this. Did you talk about this today?
My brother, who's brain damaged, he'll remember Beatles songs that I can't even remember, but he doesn't know what he had for lunch today.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
His brain.
And sometimes when the brain damage is a recent thing, people can actually regain the functioning through song and work their way back to the language. So that kind of memory has become a genetic memory. And a genetic memory is one that is independent of, basically it's stored, it's distributed and stored, and doesn't need any subcortical structure to access it. It's just it's kind of in the cortex of the brain.
It's interesting because when you say stored and you went like this, my first reaction was it's actually in the DNA. It's in the molecules,
Well,
not necessarily just focused
right.
in the head.
So that gets into epigenetics, and that's really that seems to be the mechanism for Jung's collective unconscious is epigenetic memory. I mean, I'll jump if you want to just jump to these things because I know we're going to run out of time. Why don't we talk about that now? Because it's interesting. So the people used to not think that memories could be inherited from a genetic point of view, and that was the Lamarckian theory that you could inherit memories, and it was proven wrong, et cetera, et cetera. But now, through epigenetics, did you talk
A
about?
little bit last week.
So you know what the mechanism. You want me to remind you?
It feels like a week.
Yes, please.
To remind you. Okay. So what epigenetics are, the way that it was first uncovered was a guy named Meany who was working with rat pups, and this is a good mother and child type of thing because this is really a great place to see where trauma gets inherited. So when rat pups are born, a good mother will lick the pups and lick the pups extensively, and a bad mother will not lick the pups. And it turns out that the mothers that do lick the pups change when they do that. There's an internal mechanism that either turns on or turns off various genes. And so epigenetics involve the turning on or turning off of different genes. So it doesn't change the DNA, but it changes what's up for the DNA, and that winds up getting inherited. And so those pups who were not licked, who were sort of traumatized, grow up to be bad mothers who don't lick themselves, and it partly gets sent along through the genes as they go from generation to generation. And so it is a mechanism for remembering from generation to generation, and probably has a lot to do with Jung's intuition about the collective unconscious. And so I think the collective unconscious, from a memory point of view, is a combination of universal existential conditions that every culture faces and has to navigate, just the sort of the universal parts of life as we developmentally face them, and epigenetics, by which there is a shift over time, that there is a sort of historical memory in the genetic pool that shifts. Yeah.
But then through your example, that memory needs to be cultivated then and brought out. It's not straight memory. So an action has to release that in somehow, or cultivate it or repress it. So like,
right.
So an anxious mother can also breed anxious children, as far by not only genes but also by just being anxious around them.
Exactly, social learning, etc. So yeah.
Epigenetics. Sorry. So my question: epigenetics needs both. Then?
Well, in the nature nurture formula, it's the nurture side.
Right.
It's the nurture side. It's sort of the way that, an action or an interaction or an encounter shifts the genetics. I'll give you another example. People talk about autism as being something that you're born with or you're not born with. But there are twin studies that show that one identical twin can be autistic and the other not. Now that's kind of crazy or that's hard to make sense of, but probably what's going on is that the epigenetic piece starts in utero. And so one twin in utero is having a different environment than the other twin at a critical period, and it's releasing this genetic potential for autism.
Do you know if this epigenetic phenomenon has to do with the mitochondrial RNA, or do you know what the?
It has to do with methylation, something called methylation. It's not the mitochondrial piece. That's more like the arousal piece. That's like the battery of things.
Okay.
So in methylation, there are two kinds, but it's like when a methyl group joins a gene, it either kind of binds it so it can't express itself, or it does something that allows its release.
Well, this is also the power of psychotherapy, because
Exactly.
we can then shift how the chain is going to continue.
Exactly, yeah, and the story that I want to tell about memory and the mother-baby thing is a really good example of that. Yeah, that if we do a good job, and there's intergenerational transmission, and we see this all the time, this sort of memory from generation to generation in families, especially traumatic memory and traumatic transmission, on and on and on, and including even stories of people that are trying to hide it by not saying anything, and inadvertently traumatized because the children are upset and don't know why. And it's a body to body. Lou Cozolino tells a story about that in his book. So there is no hiding of it, and that's a place where you can see that the memory at the body level is embedded, whether or not it's discussed. I personally think it's better to say something about it, tell your children about your trauma so that they can understand how you're traumatizing them partly, and work with that consciously and not just unconsciously. But yeah, if we do a good job, we can help stop this intergenerational transmission of memory.
It feels like that would be very much in alignment with attachment theory.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the earlier you catch something, the better, because that's where the attachment dynamics really set in, is in infancy. So it's fabulous to be able to work with mothers and children right at the beginning. Yeah.
And the interpersonal neurobiology, the whole field emerged from attachment theory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, good. Yeah, we can, and since you did the different taxonomies, it sounds like I'll sort of run through those a little bit or tell clinical tales and stuff. So, I guess what I'm saying is to think about memory as being very dynamic and ever-changing, and part of a fully embodied present, which is really what you're talking about in the whole Eckhart Tolle kind of thing. By the way, Eckhart Tolle and I'm on the board of this thing called GATE, the Global Alliance for Transformational Entertainment, that Eckhart Tolle and Jim Carrey are the honorary founders of. And when I saw Eckhart Tolle speak, I shouldn't say this on tape, I'm sorry.
Edit it out.
Say it. I was convinced that he had some sort of brain damage in how he was present-centered, because it was this really long day, and he came on at about 2 a.m, and he went into a trance, and everybody wanted to go home. He was the last person to speak, and he was just like doing his thing, and he was completely oblivious to everybody else in the audience. But I mean, it's really good stuff in terms of being present and the spiritual importance of that present-centeredness. So, but it was present-centered to a degree that was extraordinary. Okay, I didn't say that. All right, so the different taxonomies for memory. So the traditional is procedural versus declarative. Right, and you probably talked about that and a distinction that a guy named Larry Squire made was the difference between knowledge how to do something versus knowledge that, and that would be more the declarative stuff. So dance is a really good example of procedural memory, that's certainly knowledge how. And okay, I want to talk about dance now because I got this really cool thing because I went dancing today before coming here. And when I first started to dance, which was as an adult and not as a kid, I was like, I couldn't remember anything, and including left and right. I have this sort of left-right dyslexia, and so I was like bumping into people and really and not remembering anything. And I have this thing where if I'm in a car and I don't know where I am, and I use my intuition to say which way to go, I'm always wrong. I'm 100%, 180 degrees wrong. And so put me in the dance thing, and I was like going absolutely the wrong way at the wrong time. And so I've been sort of studying myself over the last 30 years in terms of trying to learn how to remember dance sequences, and I've definitely gotten much better at it. And I found out today really how that works, because it didn't make sense to me that this was cortical learning. And it turns out that this is the cerebellum, that kind of procedural memory for movements and rule-based motor movements or whatever is in the cerebellum, and that the cerebellum has a loop with consciousness, and so it makes sense that words get in the way of that, and that you have to sort of let go of the words and then chunk the movements. So the idea of chunking memory.
Yeah, I just saw something on it last week.
Oh, really? What did you see on it?
Oh, it's just a mechanism by which we can remember really big sequences of events.
Mhm.
It helps our working memory to put them into smaller digestible chunks.
Mhm.
That's a much more effective way of remembering things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because the chunks happen at the joints of things, and paying attention to the joints, I think, is really important in therapy too. That we.
When you say joints, do you mean sort of the transitional moments?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly, the transitional moments.
Like a series of 21.
Mm-hmm.
7, 7,
Right.
7.
Right. Or and certainly the transitional moments are where the action is. It's the space between things. But also, you know how some people always get in car accidents and other people don't? And sometimes, they'll get into car accidents that may not even be their fault, but it happens.
17 times.
Really?
Okay.
So what does it mean she drives?
So I'm convinced.
Who is that?
I have a patient who was always getting into car accidents, and I'm convinced that it has to do with how we use our eyes and whether we know how to find the joints with our attentions. So if you're doing something else in the car, if you're fiddling with the radio, or you're doing something else, you have to do it not at a joint, not at a joint place of attention. You have to know where the joints are, and if your body sort of doesn't know intuitively exactly, then you're going to be in danger. And the same, that whole concept of sort of paying attention to that is really, really important in therapy. Because it has to do with whether we're good at shifting attention in certain ways. It has to do with this dance of leading and following, whether we're following and then we start to lead, or vice versa. So
it also feels very Darwinian.
Very what?
Darwinian.
Very Darwinian, yeah. Right, because there's competition of different things, and
well, being like a bird in a flock, or not getting eaten by the guy sitting in the bushes.
To me, it sounds more to do with rhythm and
very much having to do with rhythm, yeah.
whole And some people, their rhythms are off.
Right.
Do you have any sense as to why some people are better at this, finding the joint and the connection than others?
I think it does have to do with rhythm.
But
I
what-
mean-
why are some people better at the rhythm?
Well, if you want to go back to mother-infant stuff,
Yeah.
If your mother sings to you or rocks you in a rhythmic way, and uses the prosody to do the affect regulation, uses the, the melodic parts of the voice to help the baby either soothe to go to sleep or not soothe, and if the mother's breastfeeding, the closer to the body of the mother and the more the mother knows how to sort of envelop in a rhythmic way, I think the better able to find the joints and sort of get into the joints of Mother Earth, if you will, and the rhythms, the social rhythms. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like a good argument for early childhood music education.
Absolutely.
Eva is seeing that dance firsthand at the Mantover Center, where some of the mothers and children have this flow.
Right.
It's like a dance, a rhythm of their
Exactly.
movement, and others, there's a disconnect.
There's a disconnect or a jerkiness or a pushing away or even a repudiation of that rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
You
And
know?
that's the lighting up of the genetic material you're talking about.
Yeah.
The potentiality
Right.
of that.
Right,
Yeah.
right, because the more in sync and entrained, the better able to sort of release the positive genetic and the less the trauma based or the less the locking up of different genes and this sort of thing.
But wouldn't it be also true to say that some people are genetically programmed out of sync? Like this book called The Out of Sync Child, and there's some question about that. I know in autism and Asperger, the flow, the whole rhythm and synchronicity of that person is out of sync with nature and
That's
the rhythm of everybody else.
Right, that's certainly true for autism.
Yeah.
And there's a really interesting, what's your name, the woman who's so famous, the autistic woman? Temple Grandin, thank you, has written a little piece that I find fascinating about laughter and the inability to understand how people are laughing, which is in terms of social rhythms. And laughter in social places, like if you go out to the mall and you look at the rhythm of laughter there, it's not about stuff being funny. It's about social relationships and a speaker and a listener and punctuation and these kind of social rhythms. And so she's writing about not understanding why people are laughing and feeling completely outside of that. So it's certainly true in the case of autism. I think, though, in the case of the out of sync child, what's going on there is that right at the very beginning, you've got a child that has a neurochemistry and that is out of sync with the mother's, and that usually the child is more sensitive and tuned in sensorially than the mother, and when the mother can't match it, then you get an out of sync child. But if the mother was able to match that level of attunement, is able to attune to it, you won't get an out of sync child. And so it's I think the mismatch goes right back to day one in most kids, and that a lot of symptoms that look autistic in that sense of being out of sync, because that is like the main thing, are not autism, but are this mismatch dynamic. Like if you get you get a super anxious mother, often there's too much anxiety to really give the body over fully to this thing we're talking about. And then, so I had a case of a woman that I've written about extensively that not only had ancestral type of early trauma, but then was married, this is an Indian woman, married to a very misogynist Indian man who was physically abusing her when she first started to see me, which is about 12 years ago. And he got into therapy, he stopped physically abusing her, but he was still emotionally very, very abusive. And when she had a baby, and she got pregnant not on purpose, and that itself was traumatic, and then her uncle died in India, who was the only person that was even remotely like a father, and that happened in pregnancy. So there was a lot of there was a lot of trauma in pregnancy. But when this baby came out, it was one of these Archie babies that won't cuddle, and she would bring the baby in, which is a sort of I love to do this ritual with when mothers have babies, that they bring the baby in for the first several months, and I hold the baby and I'm soothing the baby and the mother at the same time, and it's lovely for me. But this baby would not be held in the way that most babies want to be held, and she'd be like breastfeeding on the ground with the baby, on her side, with the baby arched away and not even near her body. I mean, just, and by age 2, this little girl wasn't speaking, and the mother was going through a graduate program and very preoccupied with that. And we had a moment of great trauma when I said, you need to get your child tested, early tested, because the child wasn't speaking. And so the child was diagnosed with severe autism, and then got all those wonderful resources that exist in Los Angeles. Went through the program, but the child was not autistic. It was anxiety that had been blocking the little girl, and she graduated from that program and went into. She's now 6.5, and she's in a neurotypical. Not only in a neurotypical class, she graduated through. She's now in just joined complete neurotypical, but she's hugging kids now. Every picture of this little girl has her hugging the children around her, which is really quite remarkable. So you can have this mimicry of that out of sync thing when the attunement isn't there. Make sense? We're going
So
a
that was
little.
causing the anxiety and the arching, is that?
Well, I think I'm sure the trauma in the womb was a big part of the original part of it, but then the mother's trauma made it difficult for the mother to have the natural instincts, but then at that point where I traumatized her by calling attention back to the child, the mother got in total gear and completely was devoted to helping this child do well. And so getting, being the center of attention suddenly was part of it as well, that really helped turn around the dynamics for this child.
So I'm aware of time in terms of having
A break? Let's take a
Does
break.
that feel right to everybody?